a 220-foot fall from the Golden Gate Bridge into the unforgiving, icy waters of the bay. For a 4-month-old German Shepherd puppy, it should have been the end. But what if a tragedy was actually the beginning of a miracle? This is the story of Koda, a journey so unbelievable it will challenge everything you think you know about survival, connection, and hope. It's a story that deserves to be heard, and by taking a moment to like, share, and subscribe, you help us bring more incredible tales like this to the world. Now, let us take you to that fateful afternoon, under a perfect California sky, just moments before the world changed forever. The relentless cursor blinked on Sarah Miller's screen, a tiny, rhythmic pulse of judgment in a sea of nonsensical code. For 3 hours, she had been wrestling with the same stubborn function, a knot of logic that refused to untangle. The pressure from the upcoming product launch felt like a physical weight on her shoulders, tightening the muscles in her neck and drawing faint lines of fatigue around her intelligent, 20-something eyes. Her San Francisco apartment, usually a sanctuary, felt more like a cage, its stunning view of the bay a mocking reminder of the world outside her digital prison. A wet nose pressed insistently against her hand, followed by a soft whine. Sarah looked down into the earnest, amber eyes of Koda. At 4 months old, he was a gangly composition of oversized paws, enormous ears, and a black and tan coat that was still more fluff than fur. He was her anchor, the warm, living counterpoint to the cold, sterile world of her work. He tilted his head, a silent question in his gaze, and nudged her hand again, this time away from the keyboard. A small smile finally broke through Sarah's frustration. She ran her fingers through the soft fur behind his ears, feeling the tension in her shoulders ease with each stroke. He was her joy, her comfort, her responsibility. The blinking cursor could wait. Looking out the window, she saw the afternoon had ripened into a perfect California gold. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue, and the bay sparkled with a million tiny suns. It was too beautiful a day to waste indoors. "All right, you win," she said, her voice soft. "Let's go for a walk. A real walk," Koda responded with a happy yip, his tail thumping a rapid, joyful beat against the leg of her desk. 15 minutes later, they were on the pedestrian walkway of the Golden Gate Bridge. The sheer scale of the structure was breathtaking, its iconic international orange towers soaring into the sky. The steady hum of traffic was a constant companion, but out here, with the wind fresh off the Pacific and the panoramic view of the city skyline, Sarah felt the stress of her job finally begin to melt away. Koda was in a state of pure puppy bliss, his nose twitching as he tried to process 1,000 new smells at once. He trotted happily on his new leash, investigating every bolt and seam in the concrete, his clumsy gait a picture of uncoordinated enthusiasm. Sarah laughed as he stopped to stare at a seagull perched on the railing, his head cocked in absolute fascination. This was what she needed, this connection, this simple, uncomplicated happiness. They stopped near the first tower, and Sarah leaned against the railing, breathing in the salty air. Below them, the water churned, a deep, powerful blue. She watched a sailboat glide toward Alcatraz, feeling a sense of peace settle over her. Koda sat patiently at her feet, his body a warm, comforting presence beside her. The world felt open and full of promise. But San Francisco's beauty is a fickle thing. Without warning, a tendril of white mist crept in from the ocean, followed by another, and then another. Within minutes, the distant city skyline began to blur. "Carl the Fog," Sarah murmured, a name locals had affectionately given the city's famous marine layer. She had seen it roll in countless times, but never this fast, this thick. The brilliant blue sky vanished, replaced by a damp gray ceiling that seemed to press down on them. The vibrant orange of the bridge dulled, and a sudden chill permeated the air, raising goosebumps on Sarah's arms. The open expanse of the bridge now felt isolated, claustrophobic. Koda whined softly, pressing closer to her leg, sensing the abrupt shift in the atmosphere. Just as Sarah was about to turn back, a sound tore through the thick, muffled air. It was a foghorn, deep and guttural, a colossal moan from a container ship lost somewhere in the gray void below. The sound was so sudden, so overwhelmingly loud, that it felt like a physical blow. It struck Koda with the force of pure terror. He jumped backward, yelping in panic. Sarah felt the leash jerk violently in her hand. "Koda, easy boy, it's okay," she tried to soothe, but her voice was lost in his fear. He scrambled backward, pulling frantically against the restraint. In his desperate struggle, his head twisted at just the right angle, and with a sickening slip, the new nylon collar, still a little too loose for his growing neck, slid right over his ears. He was free, and he was terrified. "Koda, stay," she commanded, her voice sharp with rising panic. But he couldn't hear her. Overwhelmed by instinct, he bolted away from the terrifying sound, directly toward the inner railing. Under normal circumstances, the barrier would have stopped him, but through a cruel twist of fate, he had stumbled toward a small, unmarked gap in the lower portion of the railing, a narrow opening for maintenance access that was rarely ever unsecured. Time seemed to warp, stretching into an unbearable slow-motion sequence. Sarah saw his hind legs slip through the opening. She saw his front paws scrabble uselessly on the smooth concrete, his wide, confused eyes locking onto hers for a fraction of a second. She lunged forward, her fingers brushing the tip of his fur, a desperate, hopeless reach. "No!" The scream was torn from her soul, a raw, ragged sound of disbelief and horror. It was swallowed instantly by the fog as Koda vanished through the gap. For a heartbeat, there was nothing but the echo of her own voice and the indifferent, mournful drone of the foghorn. Then, only silence, and the chilling emptiness where her puppy had just been. Below the bridge, the world was awash of gray and churning water. David Chen, his face weathered by years of sun and sea salt, was demonstrating a cleat hitch to two novice sailors. In his early 30s, he moved with the calm economy of motion that came from years in the Coast Guard. His past as an aviation survival technician, a rescue swimmer, had ingrained in him a habit of constant observation, his eyes perpetually scanning the water's surface for anything out of place. He was patient with his students, his voice steady over the chop of the waves against the hull of their small sailboat. He paused mid-sentence, his gaze fixed on the colossal structure above them. It was a flicker of movement against the bridge's orange steel, a small, dark shape detaching and falling. It was too small for a person, too fast for debris caught by the wind. His students followed his gaze but saw nothing. David's trained eyes, however, saw the unmistakable, frantic tumble of a living thing. His posture changed instantly, the patient instructor vanishing, replaced by the focused rescuer. "Drop the main sheet," he commanded, his voice sharp and clear. "Now." As his students scrambled to obey, he was already moving, leaping from the sailboat into the rigid, inflatable boat tied alongside, a powerful vessel built for speed and rough water. With a roar, its engine fired to life. "Stay here and wait for my signal," he yelled over the noise, before turning the bow toward the spot where he'd seen the splash. The rescue boat cut through the waves, sending up plumes of icy spray that misted David's face. The fog was a disorienting enemy, reducing visibility to less than 50 yards. He was navigating by instinct and a deep familiarity with the bay's treacherous currents. He knew the odds. The water here was brutally cold, capable of inducing severe hypothermia in a human within minutes. For a small animal, that window was even smaller. He scanned the turbulent water, his eyes straining to find a tiny, dark head in the vast gray chaos. For a moment, a cold knot of dread tightened in his stomach. Perhaps he was already too late. Then he saw it, a small, black head, barely breaking the surface, paddling with a desperate, failing energy. The puppy was being swept away by the powerful ebb tide, carried out toward the open ocean. David pushed the throttle forward, the boat surging ahead. He closed the distance quickly, cutting the engine as he drew near to avoid swamping the animal. "Hey, buddy, I'm here," he called out, his voice calm and reassuring. Koda, his body shaking uncontrollably, turned his terrified eyes toward the sound. The fight was leaving him, his movements becoming sluggish and uncoordinated. Maneuvering the boat alongside the struggling puppy was a delicate dance with the waves. David lay flat on the deck, reaching over the side. His gloved hand plunged into the frigid water, the shock of the cold immediate and intense. He grabbed a handful of loose skin and fur at the scruff of Koda's neck and heaved. The puppy was a dead weight, his small body saturated with water. With a final grunting effort, David pulled him aboard. Koda collapsed onto the deck, a limp, shivering heap of wet fur. He didn't make a sound, his breathing shallow, his eyes half closed. David quickly stripped off his own jacket and wrapped it around the small, still form, starting to rub vigorously to create some friction, some spark of warmth. Meanwhile, Sarah was running. A frantic, blind, stumbling run along the bridge's walkway, pushing past tourists who stared at her tear-streaked face. She finally reached the end and raced down the winding path toward the shoreline, her lungs burning. Fort Baker. She knew it was the closest landing point. She reached the small marina, her eyes scanning every boat, every ripple in the water, her heart pounding a prayer with every beat. She saw the boat approaching, a sleek, gray vessel emerging from the fog. A man was at the helm, and a small, dark bundle lay at his feet. As the boat docked, Sarah rushed to the edge. David looked up, his expression grim. "He's alive," he said, the words barely audible over the wind. "But he's in bad shape." He gently lifted the jacket, wrapped bundle, and passed Koda into Sarah's waiting arms. The reality of it was a fresh wave of horror. Koda was colder than anything she had ever touched, his little body limp and unresponsive. A single, weak shiver was the only sign of life. Tears streamed down her face, mixing with the bay's mist. "Thank you," she choked out, looking at the stranger who had appeared from nowhere. "Oh God, thank you." There was no time to lose. They rushed Koda to the nearest emergency veterinary hospital. A calm, focused veterinarian with tired eyes, her name tag reading Dr. Emily Carter, took him from Sarah's arms without a word and disappeared into the back. Minutes later, she returned. "He has severe hypothermia," she stated, her voice direct and devoid of false comfort. "His core temperature is dangerously low, and he's aspirated salt water. We're doing everything we can, but I need you to be prepared. The chances are not good." Sarah could only nod, her legs feeling weak. She sank into a chair in the waiting room, staring at the closed door, behind which the fate of her entire world was being decided. The night was a long, blurry ordeal fueled by bitter waiting room coffee and suffocating fear. Sarah had watched the clock on the wall tick away the seconds, each one a small lifetime. When Dr. Emily Carter finally pushed through the doors to the treatment area just after dawn, her face was a mask of professional exhaustion, and Sarah's heart plummeted. She stood up on shaky legs, bracing for the words she had been dreading for hours. But the veterinarian's expression wasn't one of pity, it was one of profound, clinical bewilderment. "I don't know how to explain this, Miss Miller," she began, her voice low. "We stabilized him. We warmed him, treated him for shock, and monitored him all night, expecting the worst. A fall from that height, the impact trauma, the aspiration of salt water, the severe hypothermia. No puppy should have survived. But he did." She held up a large X-ray film to the light. "We scanned him from head to tail. There are no fractures, no hairline cracks. His internal organs show no signs of significant bruising or bleeding. Medically speaking, what I'm looking at is impossible." She shook her head slowly, looking from the film to Sarah. "His recovery is nothing short of a miracle." The word hung in the sterile air, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Sarah allowed herself to breathe. The relief was so overwhelming it buckled her knees, and she sank back into the chair, tears of gratitude now streaming down her face. 2 days later, Koda came home. He was quieter, his boundless puppy energy replaced by a strange new stillness. He would spend hours simply watching, his amber eyes following Sarah's every move with an unnerving intensity. Sarah, for her part, hovered over him, her relief mixed with a constant, low-level anxiety. She measured his food, checked his breathing while he slept, and flinched at any sound that seemed to startle him. The bond between them, already strong, had been forged anew in the crucible of trauma and relief. The first strange event happened a week after his return. Sarah was at her desk, deep in her code, while Koda dozed on his bed nearby. Suddenly, he shot up, his body rigid, a low whine building in his throat. He ran to Sarah and pressed himself against her legs, trembling. "What is it, boy? "What's wrong?" she murmured, stroking his back. Before she could finish the sentence, her phone buzzed loudly on the desk. A shake alert notification filled the screen. "Earthquake detected. Expect shaking. Drop, cover, and hold on." A few seconds later, a gentle but distinct tremor rolled through the building, rattling the window in its frame. It was over in an instant. Sarah's heart was pounding. A coincidence, she told herself. Animals were sensitive. He must have felt the initial P wave before the alert system did. It was strange, but not impossible. The second incident was harder to dismiss. They were walking along a familiar wooded trail in the Presidio, the afternoon sun dappling through the tall eucalyptus trees. Koda, who was trotting happily ahead, suddenly stopped dead in his tracks. He planted his paws, lowered his head, and refused to move. When Sarah gently tugged on the leash, he pulled back with a surprising strength, whining insistently. "Koda, come on," she urged, getting annoyed. "What's gotten into you?" Just as the words left her mouth, a sharp cracking sound echoed from above, followed by a loud crash. A massive eucalyptus branch, thick as a telephone pole, had broken free and slammed onto the path exactly where they would have been standing. It landed with enough force to splinter the wood and gouge the earth. Sarah stared, her blood running cold. She looked from the shattered branch back to Koda, who now sat calmly, looking up at her as if to say, "See? This was not a coincidence. This was something else." Her trust in this new, unexplainable instinct was put to the test the following weekend. The fog had returned, thick and soupy, reducing Golden Gate Park to a series of ghostly shapes and muffled sounds. Sarah was hesitant to even be outside, but Koda was insistent, pulling her toward the park's entrance. Once inside, he behaved differently. He ignored the usual paths, pulling her with unwavering purpose toward the Japanese tea garden, then veering off into a dense, less-traveled grove of trees. He wasn't sniffing the ground like a normal dog. He was moving as if following a signal only he could perceive. Sarah's heart pounded with a mixture of fear and faith as she followed him deeper into the misty woods. Finally, Koda stopped beside a large cypress tree, and there, leaning against its trunk, was an elderly man. He was dressed in a thin tourist jacket, completely inadequate for the damp chill, and his face was pale with confusion. He looked up at them with dazed eyes. "I think I'm lost," he said, his voice trembling from the cold. "I just turned around for a moment." Sarah immediately took out her phone to call for help, her hands shaking slightly. As she spoke to the dispatcher, Koda laid down at the man's feet, a quiet, reassuring presence in the disorienting fog. The paramedics who arrived minutes later confirmed the man was suffering from the early stages of hypothermia. As they led him away, Sarah knelt and wrapped her arms around her puppy. The dog, who had fallen from the sky, had not just returned to her. He had brought something back with him from the cold, deep water. The miracle, she was beginning to understand, was not just that he had survived. The miracle was just beginning. Life with Koda had settled into a new kind of normal, a state of quiet wonder punctuated by moments of unnerving clarity. The frantic anxiety that had followed his accident had softened into a deep, watchful respect. Sarah learned to read him not just as a pet, but as a barometer for unseen forces. A low whine might mean an ambulance was approaching, still minutes away and out of earshot. A sudden move to nudge a glass back from the edge of the coffee table would precede a clumsy misstep by Sarah herself. His abilities were becoming more refined, weaving themselves into the fabric of their daily lives, a constant, low hum of awareness just beneath the surface of reality. She was no longer just his owner. She was the guardian of his incredible, inexplicable gift. One Tuesday evening, the hum escalated into a piercing alarm. Sarah was curled on the sofa, scrolling through emails on her laptop, while Koda slept soundly at her feet. Without any warning, he sprang up, his body instantly alert and rigid. It was different this time. There was no whine, no trembling. This was a new level of agitation, a frantic, desperate energy that sent a chill down her spine. He ran to the front door, scratching at the wood with his paws, then ran back to her, barking with a sharp, insistent urgency she had never heard before. This wasn't about a squirrel or a late-night walk. This was an emergency. "Okay, "Okay, I'm coming," she said, her own heart beginning to race. She clipped on his leash, and the moment the door was open, he pulled her into the night. He led her with a relentless, unwavering purpose. They moved quickly through the familiar streets of their neighborhood and into areas she barely recognized. They navigated the steep hills of the city, Koda pulling her past dimly lit storefronts and quiet residential blocks. It was not the meandering path of a dog on a walk. It was the determined trajectory of a missile locked on a target. "Koda, where are we going?" she panted, struggling to keep up. But the puppy didn't slow, his focus absolute, as if he were following an invisible thread only he could see, a thread pulling him towards some unknown crisis. Finally, he led her to an old, brick apartment building in the Mission District, its fire escapes zigzagging up the weathered facade. He ran up the front steps and began barking furiously at a dark wooden door on the second floor, scratching at it with an intensity that bordered on frenzy. Sarah's knock was met with silence. "Hello?" she called out. "Is anyone there?" Nothing. A faint, sickly, sweet smell hung in the air of the hallway. At first, she couldn't place it. Then, with a jolt of ice-cold fear, she recognized the scent of natural gas. She ran downstairs and found the building manager, a tired-looking man named George with a kind face, watching television in his ground-floor apartment. "There's a gas leak on the second floor," she said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "My dog. He led me here. No one is answering the door." George looked skeptical but followed her upstairs. The smell was stronger now, and the manager's skepticism evaporated, replaced by alarm. He fumbled for his master key and unlocked the door. The wave of gas that hit them was overwhelming. Inside, slumped in an armchair, was an elderly man, his face pale, his breathing shallow. He was unconscious. While George rushed to throw open the windows and call 911, Sarah knelt by the man, her medical knowledge limited but her instinct telling her not to move him. Koda, his job done, sat quietly by the door, a silent, watchful sentinel. The paramedics who arrived swiftly and efficiently took over, confirming the man was a veteran who had lost his sense of smell in the war. The leak was from a faulty stove knob. He would have never woken up. "Your dog," one of the paramedics said, looking at Koda with awe as they wheeled the man out. "Your dog saved his life tonight. No question." The story of the silent gas leak, combined with the tale of the lost tourist, was too remarkable to stay quiet. A local news blogger wrote a feature, coining the phrase, "the miracle dog of the Golden Gate Bridge." The name stuck. Sarah's life changed. Strangers would recognize Koda on the street. She received dozens of emails, some from people seeking help, others from cranks. But one email stood out. It was from Professor Annabelle Reed of the University of California, Berkeley. Sarah looked her up. She was a leading figure in the field of animal cognition, a respected scientist with decades of published research. That evening, they spoke on the phone. Professor Reed's voice was warm, articulate, and devoid of sensationalism. She was a woman in her late 50s, with a calm authority that immediately put Sarah at ease. "Miss Miller," she said, "I've read the stories, and while I'm naturally skeptical of anecdotal evidence, the pattern you've described is extraordinary. I have a theory. In very rare cases, extreme physical and psychological trauma can induce a state of profound neuroplasticity. It can rewire the brain, essentially activating latent pathways or creating new ones. It's possible the fall didn't just injure Koda. It may have unlocked a form of sensory perception we simply don't yet understand." She proposed a series of non-invasive observational studies. "His well-being would be our absolute first priority," she assured Sarah. "But what we could learn from him might be revolutionary." Sarah hung up the phone, her mind reeling. Science. A real, possible explanation. It was a daunting thought, to subject Koda to tests and observation, but it was also a chance to understand. She looked over at Koda, who had fallen asleep, his leg twitching in a dream. He was more than just her dog now. He was a mystery, a miracle, a responsibility she was only just beginning to comprehend. The weeks following the call with Professor Annabelle Reed were a whirlwind of careful observation and quiet documentation. Sarah had agreed to the study, and true to her word, the professor's approach was gentle and non-invasive. Koda, now a handsome adolescent German shepherd approaching his first birthday, seemed entirely unbothered by the extra attention. But under the professor's structured observation, a new, more profound dimension of his ability began to emerge. It was no longer just about sensing physical danger. One afternoon, while watching a nature documentary, Koda began to whine softly and nudged Sarah's hand as a fawn was separated from its mother on screen. He seemed to be reacting not to the image, but to the emotion it portrayed, the raw frequency of distress. He was sensing sorrow itself. This new awareness came to a head on a cold, windswept night. A storm was rolling in off the Pacific, rattling the windows of Sarah's apartment. She was trying to work, but Koda's behavior made it impossible to concentrate. He wasn't frantic or barking like he had been before the gas leak incident. This was a deeper, more sorrowful agitation. He paced the length of the apartment, his claws clicking softly on the hardwood floor. He would stop at the door, look back at her with eyes that seemed to hold an ocean of pain, and let out a low, mournful whine. It was a sound of shared grief, and Sarah knew with chilling certainty that he was being pulled somewhere. She also knew where. To the one place her heart still feared. Her hands trembled as she clipped on his leash. Returning to the Golden Gate Bridge at night, with a storm brewing, felt like stepping back into her worst nightmare. But the quiet, pleading insistence in Koda's eyes was a command she could not disobey. Her trust in him had become more powerful than her own fear. The bridge was nearly deserted, a long, skeletal spine disappearing into the misty darkness. The wind howled through the cables, a symphony of mournful notes. Koda pulled her forward, his pace steady and solemn. He led her past the spot where he had fallen, showing no reaction to the place of his own trauma. His focus was elsewhere. Through the damp, swirling mist, she saw it. A lone figure, standing on the wrong side of the railing, staring down into the black, churning abyss below. Sarah froze, her blood turning to ice. Her first instinct was to scream, but she knew any sudden sound could be catastrophic. Her fingers fumbled for her phone to quietly dial 911. Koda, however, did not freeze. He seemed to understand the delicate, fragile nature of the moment. He stopped, and with a quiet confidence that defied his age, he gently pulled the leash from Sarah's numb fingers. He did not bark. He did not run. He approached the person, a young woman whose shoulders shook with silent sobs, with a slow, deliberate grace. He sat down a few feet away, a calm, non-judgmental presence in the roaring wind. After a moment, he crept closer and gently nudged his wet nose against the woman's dangling hand. It was a simple touch, an impossibly small gesture against the backdrop of such immense despair, but it was enough. The woman's sobbing hitched. She slowly, hesitantly, turned her head, her eyes widening as she saw the dog sitting patiently beside her. The impenetrable wall of her pain had been breached. She lowered her hand, and her fingers sank into the thick fur on Koda's neck, grounding her to the living, breathing world. She was not alone on the bridge. The bridge patrol officers, alerted by Sarah's call, arrived moments later. Their approach was practiced and calm, their voices gentle as they spoke to the woman and helped her back over the railing to safety. They looked at Koda with a quiet, knowing respect, recognizing him from the stories. He had done what words and sirens often could not. He had offered a connection. The storm passed with the night. As dawn broke, painting the clearing sky in soft shades of rose and gold, Sarah sat on a bench at Fort Baker, the place where Koda had been returned to her. She had made one other call that night. David Chen sat beside her, a steaming cup of coffee in his hands. Koda's head rested peacefully in Sarah's lap. They sat in a comfortable silence for a long time, watching the Golden Gate Bridge emerge from the last vestiges of mist, glowing in the first light of a new day. It no longer looked like a monument to her terror. In the quiet of the morning, Sarah finally understood. The fall had not been a tragedy that nearly stole her dog. It had been a crucible. The bridge hadn't taken anything from her that night. It had given something back. It had taken a playful, ordinary puppy and returned him as a conduit for empathy, a living, breathing symbol of hope. He was the invisible thread connecting those lost in the fog to the light. He was the bridge's gift. Koda's story teaches us that sometimes, from the deepest falls, the most profound connections can grow. It is a quiet reminder that hope is not the absence of tragedy, but the unwavering love and loyalty that shine brightest in its wake. The world is full of these invisible threads of courage, moments of pure empathy that connect us all. If you believe in these miracles and want to discover more tales that celebrate this incredible bond, we invite you to subscribe and continue this journey with us, ensuring you never miss a story that warms the heart.